November 11th, 1918. The guns fall silent. 4 years of industrial slaughter are over, and Britain stands victorious. The Union Jack flies over a quarter of the planet. In Trafalgar Square, crowds are celebrating the defeat of Germany. To the world, Britain looks like the undisputed champion of civilization. But in the gray stone corridors of Whitehall and the mahogany offices of the Treasury, there is no champagne. The men who count the nation's money are staring at ledgers. Britain won the war, but the victory bled the victor dry. The national debt has exploded from £650 million in 1914 to over £7 billion by 1919. That's not an adjustment, that's a detonation, 1,000% increase in debt. And here's the kicker. Much of that money is owed to the United States, and it has to be repaid in dollars, not pounds. Britain entered the war as the world's banker. It exits as the world's debtor, the empire that once lent money to build railways. In Argentina and mines in South Africa is now on the hook to Wall Street. The British elite refuse to accept this. They look at the devastation, the debt, the loss of export markets while they were making artillery shells. America and Japan stole their customers. And they tell themselves, this is temporary. This is just a blip. Once things settle, London will reclaim its throne. And to do that, they need to restore the one symbol that defined British economic dominance for a century, the gold standard. Now, here's what you need to understand. The gold standard wasn't just a monetary policy, it was Britain's identity. For nearly 100 years before World War I, every major currency was pegged to gold. You could walk into the Bank of England with a £5 note and demand 5 gold sovereigns. The pound was as good as gold, literally. This made sterling the world's reserve currency. Trade from Tokyo to Rio was priced in pounds. Loans were issued in pounds. London wasn't just a city. It was the beating heart of global finance. But the war forced Britain to print money faster than it had gold to back it up. Inflation surged 20 to 25%. The pound, which had been worth $4.86 before the war, sank to $3.40 by 1919. To the men in power, this wasn't just an economic adjustment. It was a national humiliation. A weak currency meant a weak nation. So they made a decision. They would return to the gold standard, and not just return to it. They would peg the pound at exactly $4.86, the exact same rate as before the war. They wanted to turn back the clock and pretend the economic carnage of the last 4 years had never happened. But here's the problem. The world had changed. America now held most of the global gold supply. British industry was no longer competitive. Forcing the pound back to its pre-war value required a brutal economic adjustment. The government would have to engineer deflation, deliberately making money scarce and expensive, forcing wages and prices down. Across the entire economy until the pound was strong enough to meet the dollar eye to eye. It was economic strangulation dressed up as restoration of national honor. They were about to sacrifice the real economy, factories, workers, families, on the altar of financial prestige. And the man who would pull the trigger was Winston Churchill. In 1924, Churchill became Chancellor of the Exchequer. He knew almost nothing about economics. He famously said that when he looked at Treasury figures, the numbers swam before his eyes. But Churchill loved history. He loved empire. He loved the grand gesture. And the financial elite whispered a seductive message into his ear. It is your destiny to be the man who restores Britain's honor, who puts the pound back on gold, who makes London the center of the world again. Churchill had doubts. He was a romantic, but he wasn't blind. He worried about what this would do to working people. In private memos, he questioned his advisors. Why should the interests of finance override the interests of industry? He wrote, I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content. To resolve his doubts, Churchill hosted a dinner party. He invited the cheerleaders of the gold standard, but he also invited their loudest critic, the economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was the rock star of economics. He'd already predicted the disaster of the Treaty of Versailles. Now he turned his fire on the Treasury. At the dinner, Keynes laid out a devastating argument. He told Churchill that $4.86 was a fantasy. Based on actual production costs, the pound was worth about 10% less, maybe $4.40. If Churchill forced it back to $4.86, he would be overvaluing the currency by 10%. That meant every British exporter would face an invisible 10% tax on their goods sold abroad. To compensate, British companies would have to cut their costs by 10%. And since the biggest cost is labor, that meant slashing wages. Keynes looked Churchill in the eye and said, if you do this, you are declaring war on the working class. You will force mass wage cuts. That will lead to strikes, chaos, and the destruction of British industry. Churchill listened. He was troubled, but the weight of the establishment was crushing. The governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, the Treasury officials, the city financiers, all of them told him that Keynes was a radical, an eccentric, a man who didn't understand the moral necessity of sound money. They appealed to Churchill's vanity and his patriotism. They told him that if Britain didn't go back to gold, America would permanently eclipse the empire. So Churchill caved. He chose the bankers over the economist. He chose nostalgia over reality. On April 28, 1925, Churchill stood in the House of Commons and announced that Great Britain was returning to the gold standard at $4.86. The House erupted in cheers. The City of London rejoiced. The Times called it a masterpiece of statesmanship. It felt like order had been restored, like the chaos of the war was finally over. But outside Westminster, reality hit immediately, and it hit like a sledgehammer. The price of British coal in international markets jumped overnight. Foreign buyers in Italy, South America, Scandinavia looked at the new prices and walked away. They switched to cheaper German and Polish coal. The British coal owners panicked. They were already operating on razor-thin margins. The 10% price hike caused by the overvalued pound wiped out their profit entirely. They had one option to survive: cut costs. And the only cost they could cut was labor. On June 30th, 1925, just 2 months after Churchill's triumphant speech, the coal owners announced they were terminating the National Wage Agreement. Wages would be slashed by 13 to 25%, and working hours would increase from 7 hours to 8. The miners were outraged. Their work was dangerous, exhausting, deadly. Now they were being told to work longer for starvation wages so that bankers in London could enjoy a strong currency. Cook coined a slogan that became a battle cry: not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. Keynes's prediction had come true faster than even he imagined. The return to gold had transferred the cost of the nation's debt directly onto the backs of its hardest working citizens. The government, realizing a massive strike was coming and they weren't ready, offered a temporary subsidy to keep wages stable for 9 months. It was a band-aid on a bullet wound. Both sides spent those 9 months preparing for war. The government set up emergency supply networks. The unions organized solidarity across industries. Churchill, watching the storm gather, reportedly began to regret his decision. He realized he'd been misled. But he couldn't back down. The prestige of the empire was now staked on $4.86. The subsidy ran out in May 1926. The mine owners refused to back down. The miners refused to accept the cuts. The owners locked them out. On May 3, 1926, the call went out. The buses stopped. The trains stopped. The docks fell silent. The printing presses halted. Over 1.7 million workers walked off the job in solidarity. The general strike had begun. It was the largest industrial action in British history, and the country was paralyzed. For 9 days, it felt like the beginning of a revolution. But the government had prepared. Thousands of middle-class volunteers, university students, stockbrokers, retired officers, stepped in to drive buses and unload ships. They saw themselves as defenders of order against anarchy. Churchill, the man who had triggered the crisis, was now in charge of government propaganda. He treated the strike not as a labor dispute, but as an insurrection. He wrote, "It is a conflict which can only end in the overthrow of parliamentary government, or its decisive victory." The rhetoric worked. The leadership of the Trade Union Congress, terrified they were drifting into revolution, capitulated. On May 12th, after just 9 days, they called off the general strike without securing a single guarantee for the miners. It was a betrayal the mining communities would never forgive. The miners, abandoned and alone, stayed out for another 6 brutal months. They watched their children grow thin. They sold their furniture for food. They burned their floorboards for heat. But you cannot strike against arithmetic. By November 1926, starvation forced them back into the pits. They accepted longer hours and lower wages. They had been crushed by the golden straitjacket. The government and the city breathed a sigh of relief. They believed they'd won. The pound was safe at $4.86. They expected the economy to boom now that order was restored, but the boom never came. From 1926 to 1929, while the rest of the world partied, Britain sat in the corner. In America, this was the roaring 20s. Industry was exploding. Cars, radios, skyscrapers. The stock market was soaring. France and Belgium, who had sensibly devalued their currencies after the war, were seeing their industries recover. Britain was stuck in the mud. The fundamental problem hadn't gone away. The pound was still overvalued. British goods were still too expensive. And to keep the pound pegged at $4.86, the Bank of England had to keep interest rates high. If they lowered rates, gold would flow out of London to New York, so Montague Norman kept his foot on the brake. It was a tragedy of mismanagement. At the exact moment British industry needed cheap money to modernize, the gold standard choked off investment. Unemployment never dropped below 1 million. In some towns in the north, 70% of men were out of work. They were the surplus people of an empire that had sacrificed them for a currency symbol. Then, in October 1929, the Wall Street crash shattered the global economy. The Great Depression began. The shockwave hit Britain hard. American loans to Europe vanished. Global trade collapsed. British unemployment surged to 2.5 million by 1930. But the real crisis, the one that would finally break the gold standard, was a banking crisis. In the summer of 1931, financial contagion spread across Europe like a plague. It started in Austria, spread to Germany. London banks had lent heavily to Germany. Suddenly, those assets were frozen. Foreign investors looked at the Bank of England's books and realized it didn't have enough gold. The run moved from Berlin to London. Every day, millions of pounds in gold were withdrawn from the Bank of England and shipped to Paris and New York. The governor, Montague Norman, had a nervous breakdown and fled to Canada, leaving his deputies to fight the fire. The Labour government was trapped. To save the pound and stay on gold, they had to balance the budget. The bankers in New York and Paris sent a clear message. We'll lend you money, but only if you cut government spending. Specifically, cut unemployment benefits. It was a cruel ultimatum. To save the currency, the government had to slash the lifeline keeping millions of families from starvation. Half the cabinet refused. The government collapsed. A national coalition government was formed with one mandate: save the gold standard. They did exactly what the bankers demanded. They raised taxes. They slashed unemployment benefits by 10%. They cut the wages of teachers, police officers, sailors. They inflicted misery on the entire nation to defend $4.86. But they pushed too hard. On September 15, 1931, the Atlantic Fleet of the Royal Navy was anchored at Invergordon in Scotland. When the sailors heard their pay was being cut, they mutinied. It was a polite British mutiny, no violence, just men refusing to work, singing songs on deck. But the news that the Royal Navy was mutinying sent a shockwave through global markets. If Britain couldn't control its own navy, how could it control its currency? The run on the pound became a stampede. In 3 days, the Bank of England lost nearly all its remaining gold and foreign reserves. On Saturday, September 19th, the directors met in emergency session. They looked at the empty vaults. They looked at the telegrams from New York refusing further loans. The game was up. They had starved the miners. They had crushed industry. They had slashed benefits. They had provoked a naval mutiny. They had endured a decade of stagnation. All to defend the gold standard, and they had failed. On Sunday, September 20th, the government issued a statement. Britain was suspending the gold standard. The pound would no longer be redeemable for gold. It would float, finding its own value in the market. The elite braced for apocalypse. They expected hyperinflation, riots, the end of London as a financial center. But on Monday morning, something strange happened. The pound fell. Yes, it dropped from 486 to about 340. Ironically, the exact level it had been in 1919, before this whole tragic experiment began. But the sky didn't fall. There was no hyperinflation. The milk was still delivered. The buses still ran. In fact, almost immediately, the economy began to breathe again. With a cheaper pound, British goods suddenly became competitive. A Rolls-Royce or a bale of cotton was now 30% cheaper for foreigners to buy. Exports ticked up. The Bank of England, no longer defending the gold peg, slashed interest rates. Cheap money flooded into the economy, sparking a housing boom in the suburbs. New industries, aviation, automobiles, electronics, began to grow. The years after leaving gold weren't a disaster. They were the beginning of recovery. Britain actually recovered from the Great Depression faster than the United States, largely because they abandoned the golden straitjacket 2 years before Roosevelt did. The British people realized with a sick, sinking feeling that the suffering of the last decade had been for nothing. The unemployment, the strikes, the hunger, it was all unnecessary. It was a self-inflicted wound, caused by men in London who cared more about the prestige of the past than the reality of the present. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is just history. This is about some old monetary system that doesn't exist anymore. But here's why this matters to you right now. The golden straitjacket is a perfect case study in what happens when a government prioritizes a symbol over its people. It's what happens when elites become so captured by ideology that they ignore the reality on the ground. And it's a warning about the terrible cost of economic vanity. The decision to return to gold at 486 was driven by nostalgia, by denial, by a desperate need to believe that the war hadn't changed anything fundamental. The British elite wanted to turn back the clock. They wanted to pretend they were still the undisputed masters of the world. But you cannot base policy on wishful thinking. The world had changed. America was the new financial superpower. British industry was no longer competitive at the old exchange rate. But rather than accept that and adapt, the British government forced its economy into a straitjacket woven from pride. And the people who paid the price were the coal miners, the shipyard workers, the unemployed men standing on street corners in flat caps, the surplus people. They were sacrificed so that bankers could maintain the illusion of strength. This is the danger of confusing the map with the territory, of falling in love with a number on a page, rather than looking at the actual economy of flesh and blood. A currency is supposed to serve the people. When a nation sacrifices its people to serve the currency, it destroys the very strength it's trying to protect. The golden straitjacket didn't just damage Britain's economy, it fractured the social fabric of the nation. It created the two Britons of the 1930s, the prosperous South with its suburban housing boom, and the devastated North with 70% unemployment in towns like Jarrow. In 1936, 200 men from Jarrow marched 300 miles to London, dressed in their Sunday best, carrying a petition simply asking for the right to work. When they arrived, the Prime Minister refused to see them. He gave them £1 for train fare home and sent them away. They were the ghosts of the gold standard, walking proof of what happens when economic policy is divorced from human consequence. The misery of the industrial heartlands became a breeding ground for extremism. Sir Oswald Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists, wearing black shirts and telling unemployed men that the only way forward was to crush the bankers. Mosley never gained power like Hitler did, largely because the British middle class remained comfortable. But the fact that thousands marched in black shirts is a testament to the instability caused by the mismanagement of the era. And here's the ultimate irony. The decade of suffering didn't even achieve its goal. Britain didn't restore its financial dominance. By trying to cling to the past, it accelerated its decline. The gold standard disaster weakened Britain's industrial base just as a new threat was rising in Germany. When World War II came, Britain didn't have the financial reserves to pay for the fight. It had to borrow from America again, but this time on America's terms. The British had to hand over their gold reserves, sell off their remaining investments, lease their naval bases to the U.S. Navy. By 1945, the transfer of wealth was complete. The gold that Montague Norman and Winston Churchill tried so desperately to protect in the 1920s was gone, shipped to Fort Knox. The British Empire wasn't just bankrupt, it was liquidated. So here's the lesson. An economy exists to serve society, not to satisfy a ledger. When leaders forget that, when they prioritize symbols over substance, prestige over prosperity, empires fall. The men who made these decisions weren't evil. Churchill, Norman, the Treasury officials, they were patriots. They believed they were doing the right thing. But they committed the cardinal sin of economics. They fell in love with a symbol. They believed the strength of a nation was in the value of its coins rather than the productivity of its people. And in trying to save the financial economy, they destroyed the real economy. And in the end, they lost both. Remember, on September 21st, 1931, the day after Britain abandoned the gold standard, the sun rose on a changed world. The pound had fallen, but the sky hadn't. The catastrophe the elite had warned about never materialized. Instead, the economy began to heal. Because the truth is, a nation's strength is not found in a fixed exchange rate or a pile of gold in a vault. It's found in its factories, its workers, its ability to adapt and compete. Britain's leaders in the 1920s forgot that. They crushed their own economy in pursuit of a ghost. And the people paid the price. That's the story of the golden straitjacket. A decade of unnecessary suffering caused by pride, denial, and the worship of a number. $4.86. That was the figure they were willing to destroy their country to defend. And when they finally let it go, they discovered the only thing they'd been protecting was an illusion.